My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people, with whom we have no quarrel. From initial reports, our forces have succeeded in their mission. Several weeks ago in New Orleans, I warned Colonel Gaddafi we would hold his regime accountable for any new terrorist attacks launched against American citizens. Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again. It gives me no pleasure to say that, and I wish it were otherwise. Before Gaddafi seized power in 1969, the people of Libya had been friends of the United States. And I'm sure that today most Libyans are ashamed and disgusted that this man has made their country a synonym for barbarism around the world. The Libyan people are a decent people, caught in the grip of a tyrant. To our friends and allies in Europe who cooperated in today's mission, I would only say, you have the permanent gratitude of the American people. Europeans who remember history understand better than most that there is no security, no safety in the appeasement of evil. It must be the core of Western policy that there be no sanctuary for terror. And to sustain such a policy, free men and free nations must unite and work together. Sometimes it is said that by imposing sanctions against Colonel Gaddafi, or by striking at his terrorist installations, we only magnify the man's importance. But the proper way to deal with him is to ignore him. I do not agree. Long before I came into this office, Colonel Gaddafi had engaged in acts of international terror, acts that put him outside the company of civilized men. We believe that this preemptive action against his terrorist installations will not only diminish Colonel Gaddafi's capacity to export terror, it will provide him with incentives and reasons to alter his criminal behavior. I have no illusion that tonight's action will ring down the curtain on Gaddafi's reign of terror. But this mission, violent though it was, can bring closer a safer and more secure world for decent men and women. I warned that there should be no place on earth where terrorists can rest and train and practice their deadly skills. I meant it. I said that we would act with others if possible, and alone if necessary, to ensure that terrorists have no sanctuary anywhere. Tonight, we have.
Years ago, NATO bombed Libya to protect civilians. That was what they said. This led to thousands of deaths and a country in ruins. And I just want to give you a little brief history before I bring in our guest. On the 19th of March 2011, the NATO bloc began a violent 8-month-long military onslaught of Libya, a sovereign African Union founding member state, which had enjoyed 4 decades of stability and prosperity and one of the highest human development index scores in all of Africa. So we've said this before on this show that Libya was the most successful country in all of Africa. It was stable, had prosperity. Muammar Gaddafi brought that to the people. NATO's justification for the aggressive and bloody attack was the now infamous protection of civilians doctrine formalized under UN Security Council Decree number 1973. The French Air Force, however, had already initiated a major raid on immobile Libyan army units. They had already pulled out of the city of Benghazi, a protest hotbed, in a show of goodwill and peaceful intent. More than 400 resting Libyan officers, soldiers, medical and media personnel were massacred without the chance to fight back against an unjustified and undeclared foreign air attack. Tens of thousands more Libyans would later perish under more than 26,000 air raids, 100 cruise missile attacks, and a naval blockade conducted by NATO's 30-member coalition. Among the victims were a terrifying number of civilians from all walks of life. The number of women and children killed was especially high, as they sought refuge in civilian buildings deliberately targeted by the mighty NATO, including houses, apartment blocks, schools, and community centers. Where have I heard that most recently? As we witnessed time and time again in Iraq, Serbia, Afghanistan, and Syria, NATO justified these attacks by claiming they were seeking out fighters and weaponry housed in civilian facilities. No evidence of that has ever been presented. In fact, given its 12 years of total control over Libya, the land, the resources, the institution, the archives, the West has been unable to show the alleged 8,000 victims of rape by the Libyan army, nor the 10,000 murdered civilians, nor the neighborhoods of Tripoli allegedly destroyed by Muammar Gaddafi's air force, nor the African mercenaries supposedly imported by Gaddafi government in the first week of the Libyan Spring, which was February 2011. The actual crimes of Libyan revolutionary government, however, were real and consequential. What were those crimes? Well, Gaddafi's Libya was reshaping the political, economic, and cultural context of the African continent in radical and independent ways, not seen since the nominal decolonization of African countries in the 50s and the 60s. What Muammar Gaddafi was really doing was threatening Western hegemony. Hillary's emails reveal the true motive for Libya's intervention. Newly disclosed emails show that Libya's plan to create a gold-backed currency to compete with the euro and the dollar was in fact the motive for NATO slaughtering innocent people, decapitating its leader, and turning Libya from one of the most successful countries in all of Africa with a stable government and a prosperous culture into a failed state with open slave trading.
Price of freedom, as Jon Stewart says.
That's exactly what happened. That's what NATO did. That's not what Putin did. That's not what Hamas did. That's not what ISIS did. That's not what Al-Qaeda did or the Taliban. That's what the French, the British, and the United States did. What you just said was that Muammar Gaddafi, his idea was to keep the wealth of Libya, which is not a poor country, the way they make you want, and keep that wealth for the Libyan people. And the same thing happened similar in 1953 in Iran, when the president of Iran was democratically elected, wanted to keep the oil for their people and the oil profits. Well, the CIA couldn't have that, and they did a coup and they overthrew him, and they installed a puppet called the Shah. And then the people eventually revolted against that, and they installed a right-wing theocracy, which is called, the CIA calls that blowback. So the CIA, when they do something like that, when they overthrow and decapitate a government so that Western companies can come in and steal their natural resources, the people eventually revolt back against that, and that's how you get the theocracy we have in Iran today instead of a thriving democracy that they had in the 50s. Muammar Gaddafi made the great mistake, the similar mistake of trying to do right by his own people and keep the wealth of Libya for the Libyan people, and of course the West is not going to put up with that, and that's why ever since I was a kid, they've tried to turn Muammar Gaddafi into an enemy of the United States, even though he wasn't. The United States was the enemy of the people of Libya.
I don't even think it's American company. I think we did that for British companies.
We did it for British companies.
And then Libya, we did that for Sarkozy. The French got promised a lot of their oil by the rebels, didn't they?
Absolutely. It's the same story happened in Iran with the democratically elected President Mossadegh. It happened in Egypt with Nasser, who nationalized the Suez Canal, which is the main national wealth of Egypt. And Egypt was then attacked by France, the UK, and Israel in 1956 as a punishment for the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Similar stories happened in the Congo with the great leader of liberation, Patrice Lumumba, and in other regions of the continent. So what happened is that Gaddafi was leading a genuine project of liberation, not just for Libya, but for the whole continent of Africa.
Yes.
I actually, Jimmy, had the privilege to work with Gaddafi on some of these projects in Africa. The most important one was the building up of the gold reserve in the continent in collaboration between Libya, Ghana, the Congo, Senegal, and other gold-producing African countries, with the aim to issue a unified African currency. Gaddafi wanted to call it the Afro as opposed to the Euro. Also, Gaddafi was funding with hard cash the establishment of the African Central Bank to be based in Tripoli. Many of your viewers may not know that, but more than 19 countries in Africa do not have proper central banks. They keep all of their funds in the French central bank. Gaddafi said, no, we cannot have this anymore. We have to have our own central bank. And also Gaddafi was funding the establishment of the African Unified Army to replace the AFRICOM, the American forces in the west of the continent, and the French G5S military force. So Gaddafi was liberating Africa, helping to liberate Africa again, and helping to get rid of the West's dominance in the continent. Now, I was also a witness that the Europeans and the Americans warned Gaddafi against this. They sent him delegations, members of the Congress, politicians, diplomats in 2008, 9, and 10, warning him against his African projects and telling him that this does not represent a friendly relationship with the West, and that he must stop these projects of liberations, as Gaddafi called them. Because Gaddafi did not listen, and he paid the heavy price in 2011.
Well, I just want to show you this article from Ecologist. War crime. NATO deliberately destroyed Libya's water infrastructure. So just to recap what you said about that water project that started in 1984, Gaddafi and Libya turned places that were deserts into thriving farmland where people could grow their, and that water came from, that was underwater aquifers, right? Is that where that water came from?
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
And so 4,000 miles or kilometers of pipes and waterways, and which is twice. It's only 2,000 miles from here to New York, from Los Angeles to New York. So that's twice. So that's from there and back. That's how many pipes, and it's a wonder of the world. And the United States bombed it. And in fact, the deliberate destruction of a nation's water infrastructure, with the knowledge that doing so would result in massive deaths of the population as a direct consequence, is not simply a war crime, but potentially a genocidal strategy. That's what NATO does. The private U.S. intelligence firm, and which has played a key role in liaising with senior Pentagon officials in facilitating military intelligence operation, they were keenly aware of what the shutdown of the GMR would mean for Libya's population. Since the first phase of the river's construction in 1991, Libya's population has doubled. Remove that river, and there would likely be a very rapid natural correction back to normal carrying capacities. So they knew. So this is the private intelligence military people who are helping, working alongside the U.S. military in Libya to wreck it. And they knew, this was from a leaked email, that they knew that this water project called the River was key to Libya. And what did they do? They bombed the hell out of it. Not only did they bomb it, but they used depleted uranium to do so, correct?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, they used enriched uranium. The Libyan government, which is the puppet NATO government itself, admitted that the cases of cancer in Libya have rocketed in the years after NATO's bombardment of Libya, and that many other diseases that experts related to chemicals from the NATO bombs and rockets. And this is, by the way, a research done by the puppet government in Libya, because, of course, it had to do that under great popular pressure in Libya. The situation has been very bad, and people noticed how suddenly cancer became like big in the country, and the cases were out of control. and many Libyan doctors did their own research, and Libyan universities. In Libya, we have more than 18 major universities, all of them, of course, created and established because of the Gaddafi revolution. And the government had to respond, and it did its own research, and it came to the conclusion that, yes, it seems to be due to the extensive bombardment of civilian populations in several Libyan cities by NATO in 2011, there has been consequences to the health of the Libyan nation. And there is a great suspicion that internationally outlawed weapons were used against army locations and civilian locations throughout the 8 months. Let's remember, it's 8 months of bombardments, 26,000 raids, and 100 cruise missiles. The numbers are quite terrifying when you think about them. The number of deaths has not been fully confirmed yet, but estimations go from 60,000 to 100,000 people. Most of them are not army personnel, but civilians. I do believe that just like we succeeded in ending slavery or in getting our independence from the West in the 50s and 60s, we will be able to liberate our resources in the near future, God will.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province. We're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
An ex-ISIS chief has been appointed as a commander of a U.S.-backed militia in Syria. So, as most of you know,
a game of solitaire.
It's totally a game of solitaire. So, as most of you know, the U.S. still, quote-unquote, owns, their words, a third of Syria, mainly the area where the oil and wheat is. There are many militias that the U.S. helps fund over there. Sometimes these are terrorist organizations like al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda offshoot. We've funded and armed them. In this case, you have a ex-ISIS. You know, we're supposed to be fighting ISIS over there, right? The Syria Free Army, a U.S.-backed militant group being trained inside Washington's Al-Tanf base in eastern Syria, appointed a former ISIS chief as their commander. Today, the Syrian Free Army conducted a change of command and welcomed a new commander of the SFA. We thank Colonel Fareed Al-Qassam for 16 months of dedicated service in the SFA, the local community, and the 55-kilometer area.
Yeah, like he's a community organizer now.
He's a community organizer. He's been bringing groceries to people. He's part of the ISIS grocery brigade.
Oh, that's great.
I don't know if you know them. But this just goes to show how the U.S., the whole ISIS thing was, I'm not saying ISIS isn't horrible, but the idea that the U.S. just wants to fight ISIS, it's all bullshit. It was designed, we helped create them, then we fight them, but part of it's because we need infinite war, because it's great for our economy. We need to keep funding all the weapons contracts, military-industrial complex. I remember a few years ago, there was an article about how CIA armed and trained group was fighting a Pentagon armed and trained group. And we were like, oh, brats. But the truth is, we're creating war around the world because two reasons, really. One is instability is good. The only countries that actually threaten U.S. hegemony are those who are not unstable, the big and not unstable. Russia and China are the two biggest ones. But
wasn't that conversation that was it Lockheed Martin or basically like when Obama signed the Iran nuclear deal, they had like an emergency call to their board that was like, don't worry, it's going to be unstable in the region for a long time.
Right. Telling the board not to worry about our stock. Our stock will be okay. It's a very unstable region anyway.
And we're going to make sure it stays unstable. So everyone just calm down.
And I can remember Lockheed Martin or one of the others that said also said in a investor call that was supposed to remain private but went public, that the conflict in Gaza was really good for things, really good for money to come in, because we'll be shipping more bombs and missiles to Israel. So that's a good moneymaker there.
For at least half an hour, the four men had been throwing stones at Israeli soldiers as part of a group of Palestinians. Then they took out their pistols and opened fire on the group of protesters they'd been standing alongside moments before. According to the AFP journalist who filmed what happened at the Beit El checkpoint outside Ramallah, a cry of Mustarabin soon spread through the 100-strong crowd. It's a word that describes people who disguise themselves as Arabs. In the footage, the infiltrators are seen beating a man and shooting their guns before being joined by Israeli soldiers in uniform. 3 Palestinians were injured. Israel has refused to say exactly who Wednesday's infiltrators were, although a spokesman has confirmed that its army is equipped with such units. Following a spate of stabbings and violent protests, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that his security forces would use what he called all necessary means and methods in the fight against terrorism.
ISIS and Al-Qaeda are the mobile armies of the Americans and Israelis. When they're disgruntled or unhappy, they set their dogs loose to carry out terrorist attacks, create instability, and undermine the security of other nations, particularly those they've been unable to breach or control, like Syria, Russia, or Iran. Because they're unable to win using conventional methods, they use proxies and terrorist groups to assault these governments and to try and loosen their grip on power.
Now watch this. Now, I can't vouch for the veracity of this, but I found this very interesting. This is a video that purports to say this ISIS commander was captured in Libya and revealed to be an Israeli Mossad agent. Is that your real name? And what is your fake name in Libya? He's Mohammed Yasser Abu Allah. That's his fake name. And what's your religion? Jewish. What's your job? First Brigade of the Mossad. When did you join the Mossad? In 2002. When did you come into Libya? In 2012.
Yeah, well, that particular video, I like you said, I'm not sure either. They could test him. They could say Christ is king, and then if he bites the guy's nose off, then you know he's really Israeli. That's one way they could get the truth out of him.
So we know when CNN covers Syria and the gas attacks, they do it like this. They send a reporter, who, by the way, is the granddaughter of the deposed president of Syria, and she picks up a backpack and does this.
And there's definitely something that stings.
Hey, is that poison? Give me it. Yep, that's definitely... The Duma attack, the gas attack, we've debunked it here on the show. I want to recap it really quickly. So these are pictures of the shells they said were... Look, it's landed in a bed. You see that it's in a bed. It's on someone's porch. And here, see, there's the guy standing there. There it is. We've got it. It's the gas attack. The New York Times actually, they reported that they created a virtual crime scene. Did you ever see this, Aaron?
I did. Yeah, I did.
So the New York Times created a virtual crime scene to investigate Syria's chemical attack. They didn't go to Syria, but then they had some artists kind of create it in the way that they thought it happened. They even won an award for it. Guess what? They're 100% wrong, because the real reporters were actually, by Robert Fisk, were already on the ground there, interviewing doctors, interviewing people. Nobody verified that there was a gas attack. Nobody. There was a leaked report from the OPCW, an engineer's report, that was written but was not included in the final report. And what did that engineer's report say? That engineers, in summary, observations at the scene of the two locations together with subsequent analysis suggest that there is a higher probability that both cylinders were manually placed there at those two locations rather than being delivered from aircraft. So that says didn't happen. Whistleblower after whistleblower has come out saying that the OPCW has been captured by the West and NATO, and they have. And so now here's the Gray Zone's reporting. This is yours, Aaron. It says the Gray Zone has obtained documents exposing falsehoods and misleading claims by the OPCW Director General Fernando Arias to degrade the reputation of Duma whistleblower Ian Henderson.
What Henderson's conclusions pointed to is that it was staged on the ground. So when his report was leaked, the OPCW had a serious problem because the evidence that came out, his report, and then other leaks that came out, kept undermining the official narrative that the OPCW had put forward.
The United States has had troops in Syria, militarily occupying Syrian territory since 2014. And those U.S. troops happen to be in the area of Syria that produces the most oil and wheat. And a top U.S. government official has admitted that Washington's goal is to starve the central Syrian government of revenue so it cannot rebuild after a decade of war fueled by the U.S. devastated the country. And this December 2023, there was a vote in the U.S. Senate, and only 13 members of the 100-member Senate voted to withdraw troops. 84 members, the vast majority, voted to maintain U.S. troops in Syria after nearly a decade. Now, I need to emphasize that the U.S. military presence in Syria is completely illegal according to international law. The sovereign Syrian government, which has a seat at the United Nations, internationally recognized, has repeatedly said that the U.S. troops are there illegally, they're occupying its land, and they need to leave. The media outlet Kurdistan 24 published video footage back in 2019 that shows the U.S. troops with the U.S. flag and armored vehicles occupying the oil fields in Syria. This is like a centuries-old colonial occupation. And it continues happening today in the 21st century. Now, the resolution also says that in 2018, Trump ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. But as I showed earlier in the clip on Fox News, he actually later backtracked, and Trump himself decided to keep those troops illegally occupying Syrian territory because, as he said, we took the oil. I have the oil.
And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil.
Not only does the U.S. have 900 troops occupying Syria, but the U.S. also has 2,500 troops that are illegally occupying Iraq. Now, I mentioned that the Syrian government has called for the U.S. troops to leave its country, and therefore they're there illegally. Well, the same thing is true of Iraq. In 2020, Donald Trump carried out an extreme act of war. He assassinated the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, and he also assassinated a top Iraqi military leader, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. And in response to that, the Iraqi parliament in January 2020 voted to expel the U.S. troops. And in response, Trump said, no, our troops are staying occupying your country. And then Trump threatened to impose sanctions on Iraq because Iraq's democratically elected parliament voted to expel the U.S. military occupiers after Trump carried out an act of war against both Iraq and Iran. I'm reading here from an article in NPR. Quote, amid the fallout of the U.S. drone strike in Baghdad that killed an Iranian general, the Iraqi parliament voted to oust U.S. troops stationed in Iraq. President Trump threatened Iraq with sanctions. And I should add, they don't mention that it was also an Iraqi military leader who was killed in this act of war. The U.S. is occupying Syria's oil to prevent the Syrian government, to starve the Syrian government of revenue from that oil that it needs to rebuild the country. NPR admitted this in 2020 in an article titled U.S. Troops Aim to Keep Oil Fields from Syrian and Russian Forces. Russia is one of the world's top 3 oil producers. It's completely preposterous, the idea that Russia needs Syria's oil. But as NPR wrote, quote, U.S. forces in northeastern Syria have a relatively new mission, securing oil fields from Syrian government and Russian forces. Of course, the U.S. government is also one of the world's top 3 oil producers, so the U.S. doesn't need that Syrian oil, but it's occupying Syria's oil in order to fund separatist Kurdish forces in Syria that are basically U.S. puppets, U.S. proxies that are trying to destabilize the Syrian government, and also that are antagonistic to Iran and that support Israel. But also, the U.S. strategy was very clearly stated by a top government official, Dana Stroul. She is now in the Biden administration. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. That means that she oversees U.S. Defense Department, U.S. military policy in Syria and Iraq and Israel and the broader region. I wrote an article back in 2019 of very revealing comments that Dana Stroul made at a neoconservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And in these remarks, she boasted that the U.S. military, quote, owned 1/3 of Syrian territory, including its, quote, economic powerhouse. And then she outlined the U.S. strategy of trying to starve the government of revenue to prevent reconstruction of the rubble. She referred to the country as rubble.
Trump orders U.S. troops to leave Syria as White House declares victory over ISIS there. That's from December 19th. Trump promised to pull us out of the wars. A lot of people on the right voted for him because of that reason. Donald Trump says, we have defeated ISIS in Syria, my only reason for being there during the Trump presidency. He said, why don't we just pull out of Afghanistan? We're only there at the behest of Saudi Arabia and Israel anyway. So this is a good thing. That's a good thing. But it's going to be now reported, I'm going to guess, ubiquitously. Like this. Like it's going to be reported like this. Russia praises U.S. decision to pull troops out of Syria. Here's a guy for the New York Times, Brett Stevens, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, MSNBC contributor. He says, it's a gift to Iran, to Hezbollah and Putin, a shameful betrayal of our Kurdish allies without whom we wouldn't have defeated ISIS. Another day in the Trump White House. So he's admitting that we defeated ISIS, but he wants us to stay in Syria.
What American knows why we're in Syria anyways?
They would say because he gassed people, and so we have to go save people who are being gassed by Assad. Although that's not why we're there. We're in Syria because they want to put a pipeline through Syria. And Russia doesn't want that pipeline going through Syria because it's going to bring natural gas to Europe. He sells natural gas to Europe. So that, and also Israel wants Assad gone because he's aligned with Iran. So it's Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's why we're there. We're there at the behest of oil and Israel. And this guy says we should stay there. Why? He doesn't really give a reason. He just says it's a gift to Iran. To Iran. So he wants us to go to war with Iran too, this guy. We did Iraq. We did Libya. We're just still in Afghanistan. Later on Wednesday, the State Department also announced an intended $3.5 billion of U.S. Patriot missile sales to Turkey. And that's something. So a couple of billion, we go, okay, we'll pull out. And when asked why he pulled out of Syria, Trump said, Turkey buys a lot of our missiles. Come on.
One of his rare appearances, Mohammad Mossadegh, Premier of Iran, meets the press to reaffirm his government's unwillingness to arbitrate with Britain over nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company. With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
It's actually been an open secret for decades, but for the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected prime minister. Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. So shortly after his election, the CIA began to plan his overthrow, teaming up with Britain's MI6.
Now, the CIA, we've seen it spelling out its involvement in a series of newly declassified documents. These are the actual documents marked confidential, top secret, eyes only. It's the stuff of crime and mystery and spy novels. This one talks about the security implications of CIA letters of commendation for those who served in that operation codenamed TP Ajax. And this one, dated July 22nd, 1953, almost a month before the coup, it talks about preparing an official American statement to follow a successful coup. So let's dig deep.
If you want to understand the past 70 years of often disastrous U.S. foreign policy and military intervention, look to the 1953 CIA and MI6-backed coup in Iran that removed democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and brought back to power the Shah, an authoritarian dictator friendly to U.S. and British interests. The British and Americans didn't anticipate that their interference would ultimately set the stage for an Islamic revolution led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, which began the repressive theocracy that rules Iran to this day. This covert operation became the template for American interventionism all over the world, and like so many future conflicts in the Middle East, it began with the desire among Western powers to protect their oil interests. Elected in 1951, Mossadegh had made good on his promises to nationalize the industry.
And this didn't go down well with the British, who were obviously standing to lose a very, very lucrative resource. They joined forces between CIA and MI6 and staged a military coup to overthrow Mossadegh and put the Shah back in power, who was much more amenable in doing an oil deal with the Western powers. On paper, it was a huge success. It was quick, it was cheap, no American lives were lost, and it got the results pretty quickly. And I thought, well, we no longer need to put boots on the ground. We don't need to get into wars. I mean, don't forget, at the time, America was fighting a hot war in Korea, even considering dropping a nuclear bomb. So this was a trouble-free, easy way of changing leaders you didn't like. The 53 coup in Iran, it became the playbook for future coups. And in fact, the next year, in 54, they went to Guatemala and overthrew Jacobo Arbenz. And of course, Pinochet, Allende in 73 in Chile. In Chile, it was copper. In Iran, it was oil.
One of the few U.S. leaders who understood the idea of blowback was Ron Paul, who underscored the long-term damage of the 1953 coup in his famous back and forth with Rudy Giuliani in 2007 during a Republican presidential debate.
When we went into Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah, yes, there was blowback.
Another is Senator Bernie Sanders.
What would Iran look like today if their democratic government had not been overthrown?
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It's like we had entire training courses.
Here's one of those courses being put to work.
It is the assessment of the United States government that the Islamic Republic of Iran is responsible for the attacks that occurred in the Gulf of Oman. This is only the latest in a series of attacks instigated by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its surrogates against American and allied interests. And they should be understood in the context of 40 years of unprovoked aggression against freedom-loving nations.
40 years of unprovoked aggression by Iran against, do you know the country next door? We completely destroyed, killed millions of people, made millions of refugees, destroyed that country. You know the country next to that, Afghanistan, we've been occupying for the last 20 years. You know the country just a little farther to the west of that, Libya? We invaded that, killed everybody, turned it into a failed state. Now it's a haven for terrorists, and they have open slave trading. But Iran, Iran is the country that's been doing aggression for the last 40 years. Secretary Pompeo must explain, why would Iran target a Japanese registered vessel? So what they said was Iran is trying to screw with the Japanese oil tanker. Why? Makes no sense why they would do that. So he says, you must explain why Iran would target a Japanese registered vessel while Japan's Prime Minister Abe is conducting a state visit in Iran. And I'm going to show you how they've covered this. It's so jaw-droppingly bad. So they said that the Iranians attacked the ship and they had mines. They attached mines to it. That's a lie, because the owner of the ship, the Japanese owner of one of the oil tankers attacked near Iran on Thursday, said the vessel was struck by a projectile and not by a mine. which is what the U.S. officials assessed as the source of the blast. So that's just right away. Immediately, you know it's a lie. Even the guy who owns the boat says it didn't happen.